Welcome to Boiler Wild. My name is Eric Johnson, and today we're going to be talking about some very important topics that you need to know about. First things first, it is a great start of the week. This is coming out on Monday, July the 28th, 2025. So I'm recording this on a Sunday, working on the weekend. That is the podcasting life. That's what happens when you get rich and famous off podcasting. Something I don't know about. But anyways, the topic for today is going to be how to control fuel on a boiler, or how to control, let's say how to control combustion on a boiler and different methods of it. I'm not going to go super in depth. This is going to be more of an overview and just my thoughts. So the simplest way to control combustion would be an on-off boiler. Boiler turns on, it purges, it lights, and when it lights, that's high fire. You can have another step from this and have a high-low boiler, which is common on smaller boilers, and the burner can light in low fire, and then after, if a heat demand is still needed, the burner can move to high fire, and you'll typically see this on like a linkage burner, and the low fire, high fire can be adjusted by a Honeywell gas valve. I don't know what it's called, but it's got like a sensor inside of it, and it can adjust how far the valve opens, and it's got two positions. But the valve will have a typical Honeywell gas valve. If you've never seen them, they all look the same. The standard ones, the fluid, it's not hydrogen. I'm blanking on it, but they're all aluminum. They're square. They're big compared to the competitors' valves, but the actuator will have a shaft on it that moves that has like a little arm on it that will move the shaft based on the position of the valve and how far it's open. And it'll go between two positions. So a high fire position, the valve will be open farther. Low fire, the valve will be closed farther. But anyways, high-low or on-off, that is the simplest way you can control combustion on a boiler. That's typically only done on small boilers, and by small, like 1 million BTUs, maybe 1.5 million, but 1 million BTUs and down. And it's good enough. Like if you need something simple, it's good enough. If you were to add, any more combustion control systems, you add $1,000, $2,000. I mean, you might double the cost of the burner, but you also have to think about turn down. You're not going to get a ton of turn down out of the burner. So, it's like, well, is it really worth it? So that is the simplest of simple. And the only other time you'll see on off is with a Sellers boiler. So if you're unaware, Sellers Manufacturing out of Danville, Kentucky, makes a boiler. I do not believe they may still make an on-off boiler, but they all modulate now. But they make a boiler that's single pass and has a burner nozzle for every tube. It's a very unique design, and it's good for some applications. And the older ones would just turn on and be 100% fire, so high fire, and then turn off. and they go off of pilot runners, and the pilot runners could stay lit. So instead of the boiler going through a post-purge cycle, the pilot runners could stay lit, and it would just turn the main nozzles on and off. And that's the only other time where you'll see a larger boiler that is on off, but that's a very unique scenario. But I believe most newer Sellers boilers are going to be modulating as they have improved and changed the design. And you're going to want to get a modulating boiler, which will give you some turn down and will have the ability to control your steam pressure, water temperature better. It's probably also slightly more efficient. The next step up from that would be linkage. So linkage, I talk about linkage a lot. I used to struggle with linkage. I used to struggle with linkage adjustment, but linkage is using mechanical means to move the air damper and the gas valve or the oil valve, whatever fuel you're firing. You're going to have a step motor. That step motor historically has been the Honeywell Module motor. They're on the Module 4 motor right now. The Module 4 motor has been out for a while, though. I would say on my standards, it's an outdated motor. Honeywell still makes it, but other manufacturers have motors like Siemens, Schroeder, which is owned by Honeywell. But those motors all do the same thing, and the motor will move from 0 degrees to 90 degrees, or it can move from 0 to 160 degrees, but most typically 0 to 90 degrees, and have an arm on it, and that arm will move, and then you have to adjust your rods and your arm angles and how far you're away from the axis rotation in order to control your air damper and your fuel valve. It has its pros and cons. If you talk to the LinkedIn bros and you go online, everybody online will have you convinced that linkage is garbage, and if you see a linkage boiler, you need to immediately sell an upgrade. There is a time and place for linkage. If linkage was garbage, no manufacturer would still sell it. Now, I'm not saying that it's great, but it has a place in the market. One, it's probably sold the most today because either the burner is too small, so they want a modulating burner that is modulating. They want, of course, anyways, they want a burner that is modulating, but don't want to pay for a parallel positioning system, which is the next system I'm going to talk about. And it's just a cost thing. Now, even today, a parallel positioning system, like, it's not a huge cost increase, but on a smaller boiler, it can be a significant percentage of the cost of like the burner. And so if you have a customer who's tight on budget or doesn't want to spend any money, linkage is an option. Some manufacturers, a linkage boiler or burner is going to be more expensive than parallel positioning because they make so few of them and don't want to deal with it and whatnot. If you can get it, get parallel positioning. However, linkage, outside of what you see on LinkedIn, there are still thousands of linkage boilers all across the United States. And if you are going to have a linkage boiler, number one, the customer may feel comfortable with having linkage and having their internal people work on it, maintain it, whatever. Once you start adding a more complicated system, they may not feel comfortable with it, even if they don't touch the boiler, which can scare them, and that's a factor. Now you can educate the customer all you want, but they may not feel comfortable with it. The second thing is if you don't have people trained in your area to work on a more complicated system. So linkage is just a bunch of metal rods and arms and has been basically the standard for controlling combustion for decades. So all the old school guys know it like the back of their hands, and that's what you're going to find in most of America is linkage boilers, linkage burners, and the companies will be familiar with it because it's linkage. Not every single company and not every single customer is trying to keep up with technology and push the latest and greatest on all the boilers. You can lay out, and I've done it, you can lay out how a customer will save money by upgrading to a different system, to getting rid of linkage and whatnot. They don't care. They don't want to spend money. They would rather spend the money in fuel. Like the money that pays the fuel bill is a different amount of money than the money that would be for the upgrade. So, I mean, I've heard of companies getting really fancy with the billing so that, you know, the company can do it and, you know, be under billing amounts, bill them in small amounts. I don't know. But if you install a more complicated system and you don't have anybody to service it or you can't get parts, there is a cost to that. And, you know, if the nearest person to service it is 2 hours away, 3 hours away, like, you know, customers have to think about that. The service company is going to want to sell it either way, but if something goes bad, now you're having to bring a service tech from 3 hours away, whereas you may be able to use your local company who can service linkage. I don't know. It still has a time and place. I think there's a lot of linkage burners / boilers being replaced, and people and companies post about it online and say all the amazing savings that they're getting. Have yet to see a full annual savings report. And I think a lot of the savings has been overblown. Is there savings? Yes. Yes, there could be savings, but I think a lot of it is overblown or calculated to the perfect condition. And I would be curious to see the actual math of, you know, 3 years before the change and 3 years after the change, how much the savings were. And also adding into that with maintenance cost. So with linkage, you can spend a little bit more time getting linkage set up and fixing linkage. The next step up would be parallel positioning, but if you're losing servos, which you shouldn't be, or if you have somebody who doesn't know like what they're doing and it's making service calls longer, like that's an added cost. The money may be coming out of a different pocket from the company, but it is an added cost. But that's just something to think about, some small thoughts. But linkage, mechanical rods, mechanical arms, and a step motor. I think it's also called single point positioning. You can also get one step up and have like a cam, which kind of breaks the mechanical linkage connections, and the cam allows you to have a little bit more adjustment on a fuel valve. Cleaver Brooks has probably the most famous cam out there on their integral burner, and it allows you to adjust set screws that ride on a spring to make fine adjustments to a butterfly valve and how far it opens. It is pretty easy to set up. I mean, linkage is tried and true. It's worked. Is it the best? No, but some people don't want the best, even though you can lay it out on paper. But that is probably, that's the second way to control combustion in a boiler. The third way would be parallel positioning. Parallel positioning is where you have servos now, so like little step motors on your air damper and your fuel valve. And, if you have FGR on your FGR, whatever you have to control, and those will allow you to type in all your positions for your valves for your curve, and it makes it very easy to set up a curve and have a repeatable curve for your combustion. However, it doesn't change based on when your fuel changes and when your air changes. And your air would change temperature, and your fuel may change a little bit on the BTUs. And that can change your combustion. So if you set combustion and you have combustion air of 20 degrees, it's going to be wildly different, your combustion, that if you were to then check it in July and you have combustion air of 100 degrees. As colder air is denser, so you'll have more of it. So in the summer, you'll have less of it percentage in the actual flame. And you can adjust that by having O2 trim, which is an add-on to parallel positioning systems. Parallel positioning systems, some examples are like from Siemens, LMV3, LMV5, got the auto flame like Mark 8, Mark 9. I think auto flame, I think it started at Mark 1. Mark 1 is like, that's obsolete. I think Mark 9 is available and out. Then you have like FireEye Nexus systems and all FireEye products. FireEye has another one. You got Cleaver Brooks. They got the Hawk system, and they just came out. I think it's EOS. I'm not sure how that system relates to the Hawk. I think it's supposed to be a budget system, but it's confusing on their marketing. You have Preferred Utilities. They have their own parallel positioning system. You got LamTech. There's some smaller ones, but it's just a computer with a human interface and connected to motors. And that's probably the most popular way to control combustion these days in 2025. The cost of the systems are very economical, especially if you just need the baseline. If you start trimming them out with like O2 trim and dual fuel, it can get a little much. But, what's the cost of safety on your burner? You're not going to want to do that with linkage. So parallel positioning, well worth it when it is set up correctly. Just because you have parallel positioning doesn't mean your boiler will run correctly, and you may still have some linkage adjustment on your burner or even some manual adjustment. So don't think that all adjustment is going to come through your servos, but you just type in on a keypad or on a touch screen, I want my fuel valve to be 15 degrees, and then it'll change the fuel valve to 15 degrees. And, if your combustion looks good there, you just save that, go on to the next point. And there's all kinds of things you can do. There's tons of settings with it. I mean, it definitely increases the reliability and safety of a boiler. as long as you can have somebody commission it correctly and maintain it correctly and have parts for it. If you sell a parallel positioning system and you don't stock parts and your customer can't get parts, you have to order parts, you don't make your customer stock parts on their shelf, like they should always have a servo of each kind and whatever, like that will hamper it, but that can be avoided. Proper planning is part of having a well-run boiler room, but there's tons of settings in parallel positioning systems that can make a boiler run great. And also you can connect boilers together into plant masters easy and have them run in battery and run as a plant. That is very easy to do when you have parallel positioning systems. The most important thing about parallel positioning is make sure you have somebody that can service it that is relatively close. If you have to fly somebody in or have somebody drive 3 to 4 hours and to service it for every service call or whatever, it's going to be an issue and it's going to get annoying. That's also the reason why you should only install up to the complication that you need. It can be very tempting to check every single options box and sell this system with all these options, O2 trim, this and that, and that ends up requiring more maintenance as you are now having to maintain more controls, more sensors, more things go wrong. And if a customer's application doesn't require that, the only reason you're selling that is to make more money. Because if you were to do a cost analysis and, say like, why are we installing O2 trim, or why are we installing, this sensor or water level sensors, or, whatever, do they really need this? Yes, no, whatever. But you should always be able to verify it and you should always be able to justify why you're upgrading a controller, adding a control, or making a boiler control system more complicated. Making a control system more complicated just for the sake of making it more complicated to sell like more. Most people think like more is better. Like the boiler is now safer. Where do you stop? Well, the boiler will run fine with a standard parallel positioning system. It doesn't have to have every single option. It's nice, but if you don't have somebody set it up correctly or to service it correctly or maintain it correctly, then it can be a problem for the customer and they'll end up hating it, even though it's not the product. That's more of a customer issue. But parallel positioning, highly recommend. I get people all the time when I talk about linkage. I talk about linkage because linkage is still out there. It is hard to learn, yet when you learn, no, it's not hard to learn. It is hard to understand when you don't understand it. That doesn't really make sense. But when I used to go look in a boiler room, I would go in and be like, oh, parallel positioning, great. I know I can handle this. But then I'd go in and see a linkage boiler and it's like, oh, my gut would just drop and I'm, because normally with linkage, the burner is older, there's some slop in the parts, now you're replacing parts, and you just spend a whole bunch of time trying to get the system close to acceptable for good control of a boiler. And, you can play with it a ton to try to get good combustion. And you don't have to do that with parallel positioning. But I keep talking about linkage because there's no like one manufacturer of linkage. Linkage is just mechanical parts. And when service techs come across linkage, if they don't know how to work on it, it can easily be the one thing that will make a company have mistakes. So if somebody closes a boiler and fires it and they don't know how to adjust linkage, now they have to send somebody else to adjust the linkage and check combustion. And then, even if the person understands parallel positioning, then they go see a linkage boiler. Oh, well, I don't work on linkage boilers. So it makes you more well-rounded until somebody can send me a letter that says all the manufacturers of burners and boilers in the United States guarantee that they will never sell a linkage control system. And we have gone through every single boiler in the United States, and we have verified that there is no linkage control systems left. Until somebody can send me that letter, I'm going to still talk about linkage and teaching it to new people, because when you train new people, you have to go with the understanding of they know nothing. And some people, no names mentioned, for some reason believe that people just start out on second base when they are getting into the industry, and there's no need for them to learn the basics. They just need to go to learn what is best or what they prefer. And I still remember this conversation. This was years ago. This was when I was running service call. I was doing a startup on a rental trailer, and it was a school, and the boiler room had flooded, and they were getting new burners because the boiler room had flooded. And I think they were like 200 horsepower, and the company that was doing the burners and ordering the burners and taking care of all that, the company that ordered the rental trailer as well. So I was just there for the rental, but I was talking to the guy on site, and he was one of 3 service techs, and he was the most experienced. The company was mostly like boiler makers and welders. Now, he was older. He was easily in his 60s, and he said the company has never sold a parallel positioning system. He doesn't know anything about parallel positioning, and they're going to sell 2 200 horsepower linkage burners to this school. And I'm like, man, like that's a travesty. But there's so many people online that think just because their company only sells parallel positioning and they're super comfortable with it, or they're a dealer and all this stuff, that everybody does that. There are still companies out there, boiler companies, that have not sold a parallel positioning system and have nobody that can work on a parallel positioning system. And you may say, oh, that's their fault. But if they don't have a ton in their area, how are you supposed to learn about AutoFlame Mark 8 or an LV5 if you have 4 boilers in your area that have it? Going to a 2 to 3 day class and then randomly seeing a boiler 4 times a year with the system on it is not going to make you learn. You have to repeatedly do it and get over the hump of not knowing, because 2 to 3 day classes are not enough to learn a parallel positioning system. That's more just scratch the surface. But you will forget like 70% of everything you learned, and you'll be like, I have this manual, I have these PowerPoint slides they printed out, I don't really know. And then you'll be stumbling through it. And salespeople don't want to sell something that you can't start up, and it ends up just being the company sells the customer what they're comfortable with, not what is best for industry average, which technically shouldn't happen, but it happens. I know There's a company down the road from me, right where I live, and they just sold a parallel positioning system for the first time last year. So that's 2024. Boiler company just sold a parallel positioning system for the first time. And they avoided it because they didn't have anybody that could learn it. They were worried about the training. They didn't know how to get people training. They didn't want to send them to classes that are faraway states. And quite honestly, the 2 to 3 day training is not enough to understand. You cannot go to a Siemens LMV5 class or an AutoFlame class or a FireEye class in 2 days and be like, yep, I'm good, and then go start up a boiler and be fully competent, know what to do with all the settings and get it right. You may be able to stumble through it, but it's going to be rough. And if you are doing a boiler of decent size, like you're going to struggle. You get a 500 horsepower boiler. Now, I don't know if anybody's selling a 500 horsepower boiler with linkage. Hopefully not, but you're going to struggle. And then if you bring in somebody that is the expert and you say like, hey, teach our service tech, it's more going to be like a show and tell of the person does the work and the service tech is observing that doesn't know, but they're not going to pick up from that day or two of commissioning everything that they need to know and then remember it 10 months down the line when the company sells the next boiler with parallel positioning. So it's hard to learn, but parallel positioning is it is the most common and what you should be ordering if the customer wants to pay for it. And I'm of the position too that you should just not give the customer the option of linkage. Don't even offer it, because parallel positioning does save on service calls when you have people that know how to work on it. It's so much easier to service a parallel positioning system. Everything stays on the combustion side way more true than linkage. So then, one up from parallel positioning to fix the problem of the parallel positioning system not changing for fuel and air would be fully metered. And fully metered is the most expensive, and if you can dream it, you can build it. That's kind of how it is. There are companies like AutoFlame offers fully metered, Preferred Utilities offers fully metered systems, but a lot of fully metered systems are PLCs with custom software and programming in them. That's all done custom for a job. And you have to add in all the flow meters. And now you have to have somebody that knows how to calibrate all those instruments, how to wire all those instruments. And it just is a lot more knowledge that you have to put together, and a lot of boilers. That's just way too much. That would be adding way too much complication. But if you have a boiler that's 1,000 horsepower or, a larger water tube, a fully metered system fully makes sense as long as you have somebody that can service it. I have seen problems with fully metered systems where there's a custom program, custom whatever, and the company who does it, it's done by one person, and now that one person becomes critical to that boiler, and only they know how that program is working, and they're the one to service it, and now that customer needs one person to service their systems, which is great while that person's around, but that person may retire, change companies, not be available, and now somebody else is trying to look at somebody else's work and figure out what's going on. So that can be a downside of fully metered. I don't have tons of experience with fully metered, but The main reason people don't do it is cost. It just adds a ton of cost. And the people who do fully metered all the time will say it's super easy. Once again, you live in your own little bubble. And if you do it all the time, of course you're going to think it's easy. But go back to what I said 5 minutes ago. There are companies, boiler companies out there that just sold parallel positioning systems and can't begin to understand them and struggle to understand them and have people trained to understand them. So assuming everybody can just pick up a fully metered system and understand everything about it, understand all the instrumentation and controls that goes with it, that's a big assumption of knowledge, and we don't want to do that. But most boilers on the smaller end, I don't know when it becomes feasible for fully metered. I'm sure, if you have a long enough payback, fully metered can pay for itself. But I would say mostly comes down to you have to have somebody that can service it and maintain it. If that comes back to one single company knows it all, or one person knows it all, now you're relying on one person, and that can be, or even one company, and that can be a weakness. So that's the 4 ways of controlling combustion, and a couple of my thoughts. So fully metered is the top one. Then we have parallel positioning. You can add O2 trim, which kind of compensates for air temperature. So it's like fully metered halfway, but it's nowhere near as accurate. And some O2 systems are a pain to keep running, and a lot of them are shut off. Then you have linkage systems, which is just in mechanical engineering, they call it 4-bar linkage. That's basically what they are, but it's just arms and rods put together to change positioning of air dampers and fuel valves. Then you have high-low or on-off, which can be the high-low will have a very, very basic linkage setup. On-off won't have any linkage, as it's just fuel in, fuel out, or fuel in, fuel on, fuel off. On-off is common with oil burners that are smaller. Comes on and then shuts off based on temperature or steam pressure. I guess the even simpler one of that is coal, and you can shovel coal into a boiler, but I don't think very many people shovel coal into boilers unless you're working on the railroad and working on historical locomotives. For biomass and solid fuel boilers, that's a little different. You'll have like grates and augers pushing fuel into the boilers. That's all mostly PLC though. I wouldn't say fully metered, but there are systems out there that will like weigh the mass going in. I know very little about those kinds of systems. I've seen them. I've worked on solid fuel boilers, seen a lot of greenhouses with solid fuel boilers, but it's a unique niche in itself, a solid fuel boiler. You have to really focus on your fuel quality, as it can vary. If you're ordering semi-loads of wood chips, the moisture content in the wood chips can change and all kinds of stuff. But anyways, high-low, on-off, and linkage, and then parallel positioning, and then fully metered. Hopefully you learned something. It's very basic. If you are around the boiler industry, you'll have already known all that. But I am all about educating, and the average person would not know what I just said, and those terms would be new. So I try to act as if somebody graduates high school and they don't know the topic, then I need to talk about it and we need to teach it, because that's how we're going to get young people into the boiler industry, by teaching them everything. We can't assume knowledge, and we can't assume that they're going to just absorb all the basic knowledge with on-the-job training and just being around it. Osmosis training does not work, and I think that's why a lot of the failures of the industry and a lot of the shortage, that's a big part of why we don't have a properly trained workforce. There are tons of other factors, but that's a big one. So if you like this podcast or you have any questions, you can email me at eric.johnson@boilerin.com. You can rate the podcast 5 stars, please and thank you, if you enjoyed it. If you didn't enjoy it, send it to somebody you hate so that I can waste their time. Thank you for listening, and stay wild.